The most dangerous thing about influence is that most people have no idea it's happening to them. Not because they're unintelligent, not because they're naive, but because the most effective psychological principles operating in human interaction were never taught in any classroom, never explained in any conversation, and are almost never discussed openly, because the people who understand them have very little incentive to share them. Until now. Here's what you need to understand before we go any further. Every single day, in every conversation you have, in every negotiation you enter, in every room you walk into, psychological principles are already at work, already shaping the outcome, already determining who leaves with more than they arrived with. The only question is whether those principles are working for you or against you, whether you're the one who understands what's happening or the one it's happening to. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. The person across from you, in the meeting, in the negotiation, in the relationship, in the conflict, is not operating purely on logic. Nobody is. The human brain makes decisions through an extraordinarily complex interplay of emotion, perception, social pressure, and cognitive shortcuts that bypass rational analysis almost entirely. And if you don't understand how those shortcuts work, you are, without knowing it, vulnerable to every single one of them. This is not about manipulation in the crude sense. It is not about deceiving people or engineering outcomes at someone else's expense. It is about understanding the architecture of human decision-making clearly enough that you can navigate it with precision, protecting yourself from being influenced unconsciously, and communicating in ways that actually land rather than simply sound good. The distinction matters. Because knowledge of these principles, used with integrity, makes you a better communicator, a sharper negotiator, a more effective leader, and a harder person to manipulate. Used without integrity, it makes you someone who eventually gets found out. And getting found out is the end of everything these principles can build. Use what follows carefully. Use it honestly. And use it with the understanding that the goal is not to outsmart people. It is to stop being outsmarted without realizing it. There are 6 principles. Each one is grounded in decades of psychological research. Each one is operating in your interactions right now, whether you know it or not. And each one, once understood, changes the quality of every conversation you will ever have. The first principle is the one that shapes every interaction before it begins, and almost no one accounts for it. The frame controls the outcome before the content does. Here is what a frame is, precisely. A frame is the context within which information is interpreted. It is the lens that determines what meaning gets assigned to everything that follows. And here is why it matters more than almost anything else in human communication. The human brain does not evaluate information in a vacuum. It evaluates information relative to the context in which that information arrives. The same words, the same facts, the same proposal, delivered inside different frames, produce categorically different responses. Not slightly different, categorically different. Because the frame determines what cognitive and emotional processing system gets activated before the content is even considered. Here is a concrete example. A doctor tells a patient that a surgical procedure has a 90% survival rate. Most patients, presented with this frame, feel reasonably confident. The same doctor presents the same procedure to a different patient by saying it carries a 10% mortality rate. Most patients presented with this frame feel significantly more anxious and are more likely to hesitate or decline. Same procedure, same statistical reality, different frame, categorically different emotional response and decision outcome. This is called the framing effect, and it was documented rigorously by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. But here is what the research papers don't tell you. This effect is not limited to statistics or medical decisions. It operates in every conversation you have. In every negotiation, in every moment where you are either the one setting the frame or the one receiving it. And whoever sets the frame first controls the conversation. Not because they're more intelligent, not because their position is stronger, but because the human brain defaults to the first frame it receives and evaluates everything subsequent information against that anchor. Here's how this works in practice. When you're entering a negotiation, a difficult conversation, or any interaction where the outcome matters, the person who speaks first about what this conversation is about is the person who sets the frame. And once a frame is set, dislodging it requires conscious, deliberate effort that most people never make, because most people don't even realize a frame was established. The practical application is this. Before any significant interaction, decide what frame you want operating, not just what you want to say, what context you want your words received in. Are you framing this as a problem to be solved together or as a position to be defended? Are you framing the other person as a partner or an adversary? Are you framing the outcome as a mutual gain or a zero-sum contest? And then, critically, establish that frame before the other person establishes theirs. Not aggressively, naturally, through the language you choose in the opening of the interaction, through the questions you ask first, through the way you define what this conversation is for. Because once your frame is the operating context, every piece of information that follows gets filtered through it. And that filter is the most powerful advantage available in any communication. There is also a defensive dimension to this principle that is equally important. When you're in an interaction where the other person has already established a frame that doesn't serve you, where the conversation has been positioned in a way that puts you at a disadvantage before a word of substance has been exchanged, you need to know how to reframe without appearing defensive. The technique is not to argue with the frame directly. Arguing with a frame accepts its terms. Instead, you introduce a new frame as if it's simply a more complete version of the same conversation. I think there's a broader way to look at this that serves both of us better. That sentence doesn't reject the existing frame. It expands past it, and in expanding past it, it quietly replaces it. Now your frame is operating, and the conversation moves inside yours. This is one of the most valuable communication skills available to any human being, and virtually no one develops it deliberately. The second principle is the one that makes people feel understood before you've agreed with anything they've said, and it's the foundation of every lasting influence: strategic validation. Here is the error most people make when they want to persuade someone. They go directly to their own position. They present their case. They make their argument. They explain why they're right. And the person on the other side, regardless of how compelling the argument is, experiences a physiological response that the argument itself cannot overcome. Defensiveness. Because the human brain, when it perceives that its current position is under challenge, does not respond first with evaluation. It responds first with defense. The emotional brain activates before the rational brain has a chance to process the incoming information. And once the emotional brain is in a defensive state, the rational brain becomes significantly less accessible. The argument that might have been persuasive under different conditions hits a wall of prior commitment and emotional resistance. This is why the most logically airtight arguments often produce the least movement. Not because logic doesn't matter, but because logic is delivered to the wrong system. The defensive brain is not running a logic evaluation. It is running a threat assessment. And until the threat assessment clears, the logic evaluation doesn't begin. Strategic validation is the technique that clears the threat assessment before the conversation moves into substance. And it does this through one of the most powerful mechanisms in human psychology, the feeling of being genuinely understood. Here is what genuine understanding does at a neurological level. When a person feels that their position, not necessarily agreed with, but truly understood, their nervous system shifts out of the defensive state and into a more open, receptive state. The emotional brain, having registered that it is not under attack, releases its grip on the processing pipeline, and the rational brain becomes available. This is the window, and strategic validation is how you open it. Here's what it looks like in practice. Before you introduce your own position, you articulate theirs, not as a setup for why it's wrong, not as a formality before the real conversation begins, but as a genuine demonstration that you have fully received their perspective, that you understand not just what they're saying, but why they're saying it, what experience or logic or value is producing their position. The specific language matters. Not "I understand your point." That's a formality the brain recognizes and discounts. Not "I hear what you're saying." That's often perceived as a precursor to disagreement. But something more specific, more demonstrably accurate about their actual position. What I'm hearing is that your concern isn't primarily about the cost. It's about whether the investment will actually produce the result you need. And given what happened with the last initiative, that skepticism makes complete sense. That response does something remarkable. It demonstrates understanding at a level of specificity that cannot be faked. It shows that you listened, that you processed, and that you understand the real concern beneath the surface position. And it validates the emotional logic of their position without agreeing with the position itself. That distinction is critical. Validation is not agreement. You are not saying their position is correct. You are saying their position is understandable. That given their experience and their priorities, it makes sense that they would be where they are. And that small but profound difference between understanding and agreeing is what makes validation feel genuine rather than manipulative. Because here's what happens next. Once someone feels genuinely understood, they become dramatically more open to understanding you. The reciprocity principle activates. You gave me the experience of being understood, and I am now neurologically primed to return that experience. And in that state of mutual openness, the conversation can move into substance with a fraction of the resistance it would have encountered otherwise. This is not a trick. It is a more accurate model of how human communication actually works. And once you use it consistently, you will never approach a difficult conversation the same way again. The third principle is the one that operates in every negotiation, every request, every situation where you need someone to say yes, and most people activate it accidentally rather than deliberately, the contrast effect. The human brain does not evaluate things in absolute terms. It evaluates them in relative terms, always. The value, the reasonableness, the acceptability of any option is not assessed against an objective standard. It is assessed against whatever option was most recently considered. And that means the option you present before your actual request does more work than the request itself. This is called the contrast effect, and it is one of the most reliably demonstrated phenomena in the psychology of judgment and decision-making. Its applications range from pricing strategy to negotiation to everyday requests. And once you understand it, you will see it operating everywhere, including in situations where it's being used on you. Here's the simplest version. You want to ask someone for an hour of their time. If you ask directly for an hour, the brain evaluates that request against its default sense of what a reasonable request looks like. But if you first ask for 3 hours, a request that gets declined, and then follow with the request for 1 hour, the hour now gets evaluated against the 3-hour anchor. It feels dramatically more reasonable, more modest, more acceptable. The same request in absolute terms, but a categorically different experience of that request because of what it's being measured against. This is why skilled negotiators never open with their actual position. They open with a position calibrated to make their actual position feel like a reasonable compromise. Not because they're being dishonest, the opening position is real, and they would accept it if the other side agreed. But because they understand that every position gets evaluated in contrast to what preceded it, and they choose what precedes it deliberately. Here's how to apply this beyond negotiation. When you're making any request, any proposal, any ask, consider what gets presented before the actual ask. If you're asking for a significant commitment of resources, present the fuller version first, not as a manipulation, but because the fuller version may genuinely be what you'd prefer. And presenting it first allows your actual ask to land as the reasonable middle ground it may genuinely be. When you're presenting options, sequence them from most to least demanding. Each option gets evaluated against the one before it. And the one that feels most reasonable in that sequence is the one most likely to be chosen. There is also a critically important defensive application. When you're on the receiving end of a negotiation or a request, train yourself to identify the anchor. The first number offered, the first option presented, the first frame established. That is the anchor, and your brain will evaluate everything against it automatically unless you consciously intervene. The intervention is simple, but requires discipline. Before evaluating anything, ask yourself, what would this look like if I hadn't seen that first option? What is my independent assessment of this, unanchored from what I was shown first? That question breaks the automatic contrast processing and gives your rational brain a chance to evaluate the actual offer rather than the offer relative to the anchor. This skill, the ability to identify and neutralize anchors in real time, is one of the most valuable cognitive tools available in any context where decisions are being made. And the people who lack it are consistently out-negotiated, not because the other side is smarter, but because the other side understood something about how judgment works that they didn't. The fourth principle is the one that makes people trust you faster than any credential or track record can: the strategic use of vulnerability. This is the principle most commonly misunderstood, because when most people hear "use vulnerability strategically," they interpret it as performing weakness, as manufacturing a flaw to seem more relatable. as the kind of calculated self-deprecation that everyone can see through immediately because it's too convenient and too controlled. That's not what this is. Real strategic vulnerability is not about manufacturing weakness. It is about the deliberate, honest, appropriately timed disclosure of something true and human about yourself that creates a specific and powerful psychological effect in the person receiving it. Here's the effect. When someone shares something genuinely vulnerable, something that costs them something to share, something that reveals a real limitation or uncertainty or experience of failure, the social brain of the person receiving that information does something extraordinary. It shifts its classification of the speaker from person to evaluate to person to trust. Because vulnerability at a biological level is a signal of non-threat. It is the showing of an undefended position. And the human social brain, which is always running a threat assessment in the background of every interaction, responds to an undefended position with a reduction in its own defensive posture. Put simply, when you show me something real and imperfect about yourself, I stop protecting myself from you. And when I stop protecting myself from you, I start connecting with you. And connection is the foundation of trust. And trust is the foundation of every lasting form of influence. Here's the critical distinction between strategic vulnerability and performed vulnerability. Strategic vulnerability is honest. It shares something that is genuinely true, genuinely imperfect, and genuinely costs something to disclose. The cost is what makes it land. If the disclosure costs you nothing, if you're sharing a flaw that is actually just another form of strength, like I work too hard or I care too much, the brain recognizes the performance immediately and the effect reverses. Instead of trust, you produce skepticism. Because the brain knows that genuine vulnerability is uncomfortable, and comfortable vulnerability is theater. Here's what strategic vulnerability looks like in practice. Before a negotiation or high-stakes presentation, you acknowledge a genuine gap in your preparation or knowledge. I want to be upfront. I don't have the full picture on the regulatory piece of this yet, and I'd rather tell you that directly than give you something I'm not confident in. That disclosure does several things simultaneously. It is honest. It demonstrates self-awareness. It signals that when you do express confidence, that confidence can be trusted because you've shown you won't perform confidence you don't have. And it produces, in the person receiving it, a shift in their threat assessment that no amount of polished presentation could create. The timing matters enormously. Vulnerability disclosed early in an interaction has a disproportionate effect on the trust that develops throughout that interaction. Because it sets a context, this person is honest with me even about uncomfortable things, and everything subsequent gets filtered through that context. The same disclosure made late in an interaction after a pattern of performed confidence lands very differently. It feels reactive rather than genuine, and reactive vulnerability reads as damage control rather than character. Lead with the real, not all of it. Appropriate disclosure means sharing what's relevant, not confessing everything. But the willingness to show a genuine limitation, offered at the right moment, builds more trust than any credential ever could. The fifth principle is the one that changes the outcome of conflicts, negotiations, and difficult conversations more reliably than any other technique available: the precision question. Most people, when they want to change someone's position, argue. They present evidence. They make the case for why their view is correct and the other view is wrong. And the person on the other side, for all the reasons we've already discussed, becomes more entrenched rather than less. The precision question does the opposite. Instead of arguing against someone's position, it asks them to examine it, with specificity, with detail, with a precision that the position in most cases cannot survive intact. Here's the psychology. Most positions that people hold strongly have not been fully examined by the person holding them. They feel solid, they feel well-founded, but that feeling of solidity comes from not having been looked at too closely, from existing at the level of general principle rather than specific detail, because at the level of general principle, most positions feel coherent. At the level of specific detail, most positions start to develop complexity, contradiction, and uncertainty that the person hadn't previously confronted. The precision question creates that confrontation, not through argument, through inquiry. Here's what it looks like. Someone states a strong position. Instead of disagreeing, you ask a question that requires them to be specific about something their position depends on but has left unexamined. When you say this approach never works, What specifically are you referring to? What's the example that's driving that conclusion? You mentioned the timeline is unrealistic. Walk me through what timeline you think would work and what it's based on. What would need to be true for you to feel differently about this? Each of these questions does the same thing. It invites the person to move from the level of general position to the level of specific detail. And at the level of specific detail, two things almost always happen. First, they encounter the complexity and uncertainty that the general position was concealing, and their grip on the position loosens. Second, the act of being asked to be specific about their position makes them feel genuinely heard, not challenged, but engaged with seriously. And that feeling of serious engagement reduces defensiveness and opens the door to actual movement. This is the opposite of argument. Argument says, your position is wrong. The precision question says, tell me more about your position. And paradoxically, being invited to tell you more about their position is what creates the conditions for that position to change. There is a specific variant of this technique that is the most powerful version available. It's called the what would it take question, and it does something that almost no other conversational move can do as efficiently. What would it take for you to feel comfortable moving forward with this? That question does three things simultaneously. It acknowledges that their current hesitation is valid and understandable. It invites them to define the conditions for their own yes, which means when those conditions are met, they cannot claim the conditions weren't sufficient. And it gives you precise, actionable information about what is actually blocking agreement rather than forcing you to guess. Most people never ask this question because it feels vulnerable. It implies that you don't already know what they need. But that apparent vulnerability is actually precision. And precision, in a conversation where both parties have been operating on assumptions, cuts through more resistance in a single sentence than an hour of argument ever could. The sixth principle is the one that most people spend their entire lives learning the hard way, and the one that separates people who influence effectively from people who simply communicate loudly: the power of silence as a negotiating tool. We have talked about silence before in the context of presence and respect. But silence in the context of negotiation and high-stakes communication operates through a completely different mechanism. And its effects are so reliable, so well documented, and so consistently underused that understanding it represents one of the most immediately applicable advantages you can develop. Here's the fundamental dynamic. In any conversation where something is being decided, where a position is being held, a number is being negotiated, a request is being considered, silence creates pressure. Psychological pressure. Specific, directional, and powerful. And here is the critical asymmetry. The pressure created by silence falls disproportionately on the person who is most uncomfortable with it. And the person who is most uncomfortable with silence is almost always the person who has the most unresolved anxiety about the outcome. This means that silence, used at the right moment, is a diagnostic tool as much as a strategic one. It reveals, through who fills it and how quickly, where the real pressure in the conversation lives. And once you know where the pressure lives, you know where the leverage is. Here's the most common scenario where this principle applies with maximum effect. You make a request, a proposal, or an offer. And then, critically, deliberately, you stop talking. Not for a dramatic period. Long enough. Long enough for the social pressure to fill the silence to activate. Long enough for the other person's nervous system to register the gap and produce the impulse to close it. Most people at this point make a devastating error. They fill the silence themselves. They add qualifications. They soften the proposal. They introduce concessions they hadn't planned to make. They talk themselves out of the position they arrived with. Not because the other side pushed back, but because the silence felt like pushback. Because the discomfort of the unresolved gap was interpreted as resistance, and the response to perceived resistance was to accommodate. The person who can sit in that silence, who can let it exist without interpreting it as a problem that requires their intervention, almost always leaves the conversation in a better position than the one who fills it. Because the silence they sat in was not actually resistance. It was just silence. And silence is only a problem for the person who needs it resolved. Here's what to watch for when the other person fills the silence. When someone fills silence that they didn't create, they almost always reveal something about their real position, about where the flexibility in their stated position actually lives, about what they're most concerned about what they'd accept that they didn't open with. Silence makes people talk. And talking, when it's driven by the need to fill a gap rather than by a deliberate strategic choice, produces disclosure. That disclosure is the most valuable thing in the conversation, and it only becomes available to you if you have the self-possession to remain quiet long enough to receive it. The development of this skill is not complicated, but it requires one thing that most people find genuinely difficult: the willingness to tolerate your own discomfort without immediately resolving it. The ability to feel the social pressure of an unfilled silence and to recognize it as pressure, real, physiological, present, and to not act on it. That ability, practiced over time, becomes one of the most reliable advantages available in any high-stakes communication, because it gives you access to information that the other side didn't intend to share. And information, in any negotiation or complex conversation, is the ultimate currency. Here is what all 6 principles have in common, beneath the psychology, beneath the research, beneath the specific techniques. They are all tools for seeing more clearly, for understanding what is actually happening in human interaction beneath the surface of what is being said, for developing the precision to communicate with the full complexity of how human beings actually make decisions, rather than the simplified, rational model that most communication assumes and that consistently produces less than it should. The frame principle shows you that context is more powerful than content. The validation principle shows you that being understood precedes being persuaded. The contrast principle shows you that judgment is always relative. The vulnerability principle shows you that honesty accelerates trust more than polish does. The precision question shows you that inquiry moves people where argument cannot. And the silence principle shows you that restraint reveals what pressure conceals. Together, these principles form a map. Not a map for outsmarting people, that is the wrong goal, and produces the wrong outcomes. A map for understanding people, for meeting them where they actually are, rather than where your argument assumes they should be. For communicating with the full architecture of human psychology rather than against it. Because here is the final truth. The most effective communicators are not the most persuasive. They are the most precise. They understand what is actually happening in an interaction, and they respond to that, not to their own script, not to their own agenda, not to the simplified version of the other person that makes their argument easiest to make. They respond to reality. And reality, clearly seen and honestly engaged with, is more persuasive than any technique could ever be. So the question is not, how do I use these principles to get what I want? The real question, the one worth carrying into every conversation that matters, is this: do I understand what is actually happening here well enough to respond to it honestly? Because the answer to that question is what separates influence that lasts from influence that backfires. What separates communication that builds something from communication that extracts something? What separates the person who understands these principles from the person these principles are used on? You now have the map. What you build with it is entirely up to you.